I'm Thea Hilhorst of the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, and this is lecture 2 of my series on how to design your research and do it. This lecture is about theory and a literature review. I will show you what there are different types of theory that you will all use in your research, and I will give you pointers on how to do a literature review. So let's get started. Now, there are 3 types of theory that you use in your research design and your research. First, there's a piece of meta theory. Now, the meta theory is something where you declare yourself. It identifies you as a researcher, and it's usually the same across different pieces of research. So in my case, in different types of research I do throughout the years, I may still say I'm a social constructivist, I'm actor-oriented, I do interactive research, or I'm a feminist researcher. Those are the kind of meta-theoretical declarations behind which there's of course a large body of theory and a way of thinking, even almost the way you look at the world. Now on the other side is applied theory. Applied theory is actually very simple. It is what have other researchers done before me, how have they approached my topic, and what have they found. So the applied theory is really about the issue that you want to research. Then there's, in between those two, what I would call an intermediate theory. And that leads you to the analytical framework that you will use for your research. So this intermediate theory is consistent with the meta theory. It follows from there, it flows, but it is also more concrete and it provides handles that help you to answer your research questions. Now, I'll give you first an example, which is from Gloria Nguya, a PhD candidate of mine, who did her research on internally displaced people in Congo. So she said, I'm interested in the importance of social networks for petty trading of internally displaced women in DRC. That was her research interest. Now first, the meta theory she used, she says, I'm actor-oriented. I want to write from the perspective and the agency of women. Her applied theory is, what do we already know about IDPs and gender in DRC? What do we know? Because what have other people written about livelihoods of IDPs more broadly? About how social networks play a role? What are the gaps, therefore, what my research will address? So in this particular case of applied theory, it is not just empirical. We can also use theoretical concepts, theoretical ideas, but only in as far as they are being applied to your topic. So you will say, how did other researchers before me approach that same question? With what type of theory? And if they have used social network theory, what have they done and what did they find? Now, on the basis of that inventory, you could say, of what we already know about your topic and how other authors before you, how other researchers before you have written about it, that is when you can actually convincingly say, so this is why I do my research and this is the contribution of my research. These are the gaps that my research will address. Now in her case, her intermediate theory is what gives her analytical scheme for her research. These are concepts on social network that may or may not have been developed in relation to IDPs in Congo. These are concepts on social networks such as the vertical networks or horizontal, whether they're binding or bonding. It's general theory on social networks. And she also wants to use general theory on livelihoods in conflict-affected settings. How do we define livelihoods and how can we study them? Now, all these three types of theory are all part of your research design and later on how you report on your research. So the literature review, which comes after the introduction and will lead us into your research question, that is where we place the applied theory. What do we know about the topic? So note that this can also contain theoretical elements. How have other research before me approached the topic? For example, there's so far no analysis of IDP petty training from a feminist perspective, but you only bring in those larger theories to the extent that they are used to talk about your subject. Now, the conceptual framework only comes after your research question and before the methodology. That contains your meta-theory, usually it's just one paragraph, and the intermediate theory. How will I approach this? What are my key concepts and how do they relate? And of course it's beautiful when you can put them in relation by giving us a figure or a drawing or a graph. Now I'm going to that literature review. So that's the place between the introduction and the actual research question, where you say, what do we already know about my topic? So the purpose of the literature review is that it's a foundation of what is known and what is not yet known. It positions and justifies your own work. And it ends with the research questions, or a very clear statement of the contribution of your work. Now for this literature review you can use different sources. Anything can be used. It could be newspaper articles, it could be web-based information, it could be policy reports, and of course academic literature, journal articles and books. Now, even though you can use any type of source, you have to be very careful and very specific that you know what type of source it is and treat these accordingly. Because we all know a newspaper item doesn't have the same status as an academic paper. So, as a rule of thumb, make sure that you never group them together. So, when you use your sources at the end of your sentence, it could be that your sentence says, there's a lot of interest in my topic. And then you show some research, some newspaper articles, or a clip from the BBC, or whatsoever. And then only your next sentence, or maybe even your next paragraph says, there's also a lot of interest in my topic from the academic side. And then you give the sources that are academic in nature. So don't mix them up, because then we don't know whether you actually know the difference and what the sentence really relates to the newspaper clippings or to the serious academic literature. Now, if you're looking for academic sources, there are many bibliographic databases, and you can find them all when you go to the tutorials of the library. They will give you all the different databases, how to use them, for what purpose, what will you find there. In reality, I noticed that many people use Google Scholar, and they may use other databases too, but very often we start with Google Scholar, and frankly we often end with Google Scholar. So I thought it's useful if I give you some tips on how I use Google Scholar, because believe me, I also use mainly Google Scholar. Now, I have an example here of one item that you could have found in Google Scholar if you asked for humanitarian arenas, which is my topic. So this is what you will see in Google Scholar. Now, if you go to those two brackets below the reference, that is a very, very handy feature of Google Scholar. If you click on it, you get options for how you can give the bibliographical details of this source in the bibliography of your research design or your research paper. So you can simply cut and paste the bibliographic details according to the style you prefer. They give different styles of those details. You just cut them and paste them to the bibliography in your research paper. Now that saves you a lot of time and trouble. The other tip I wanted to give about Google Scholar is about related articles. Have you ever pressed on related articles? Because that is really interesting, especially if your source that you're interested in, the original source, is already a little bit older, because then Google gives you all the different sources that have referenced your original source. Now, not all of that will be relevant. People can reference it for many different reasons. But it is very interesting to scroll down that list of articles that have used your source article and see whether perhaps there's something more recent or a commentary or somebody who brought the argument further that you can build on and that you can use as an additional source. So you can use the original source of Google Scholar and then dig deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, the literature review, the structure and the writing. Let me start with what you don't do. So, not do, and what is not good. And that is that you just list all your sources one by one. Saito 1999 found ... Jackson found. Appleby found. This is my very boring and unconvincing literature review. That's not how it works. A literature review needs a logical structure, like anything else, any piece you write. So you start to make an outline and you detail a topic sentence for each paragraph that you want to use in the outline, in the literature review. So I go back to the example of the internally displaced people in the DRC. So your first paragraph you want to be about numbers of internally displaced people in the DRC. Probably mainly coming from reports. Then your next paragraph, what do IDPs usually do for a living? Have we found other literature that talks about livelihoods of IDPs and what do they say? What are their main points? Third paragraph, what is the role of petty trading in those livelihoods? We zoom out. We have all the livelihoods. We zoom in. We have all the livelihoods and now we zoom in on the role of petty trading. So that is how you make an outline of your literature review. And then the final I wanted to show to you is the importance of bridging language for the flow. And this is really important. If a paragraph consists of simple sentences, this person found this, another person found that, and yet this person argues this, we still don't know very much. You need this bridging language to give us the flow and understanding of your argument that you weave through this paragraph. So you could start saying, several reports found that. And then you could say, on the other hand, in the case of Tanzania, a contradictory trend was found, namely, and that is another source. So here the argument builds up. We say there's a general finding of this, yet beware, there are also other findings that show that there are exceptional cases, in this case Tanzania, where things happened completely the other way around. So this is the kind of bridging language that gives me a sense of the flow and that you use to weave the sentences together to give us an argument throughout the paragraph. Now this is all about how you do the literature review and build in that flow into the literature review. But remember always that your literature review, where you have your applied theory about your topic, fits into the entire research design and then later also in your research paper, because this order of elements and the logic of the research design is also the logic that you can use when you write an academic article that you want to send to a journal and where you report about your research. So you start with a title that flows, it's already informative, flows into the introduction where you justify your research. So what? Who cares? What are you going to do? Very summary. Flows into the literature review. Because the fact that I'm interested in a topic doesn't mean I just need to go there and do the research. No, of course not. Before I do my research, I want to know if research was already done and what other researchers have found. And that is the literature review. And only then we can say, all right, Now I can define my research questions of this research and how it will contribute to the larger body of knowledge that we already have. And it's only when your research questions are clear, then you ask yourself, how am I going to do this? What are the concepts? What is the theoretical framework I will use and apply to analyze my case? And what is the methodology I will use? So this is lecture 2 of my series. Thank you. Keep watching.